God is able, He will never fail. He is Almighty God, greater than all we seek, greater than all we ask. He has done great things. Lifted up, He defeated the grave, raised to life. Our God is able. In His name we overcome. For the Lord our God is able. Yeah. God is with us. He is on our side. He will make a way. Far above all we know, far above all we hope. He has done great things. Lifted up, He defeated the grave, raised to life. Our God is able. In His name we overcome. For the Lord our God is able. Yeah, 'cause God is with us. He will go before. He will never leave us. He will never leave us. Oh, God is for us. He has open arms. He will never fail us. He will never fail us. Lifted up, He defeated the grave, raised to life. Our God is able, and in His name we overcome. For the Lord our God is able. Lifted up, He defeated the grave, raised to life. Our God is able. In His name, oh, we overcome. For the Lord our God is able. For the Lord our God is able. For the Lord our God is able. Amen. Over to you, Paul.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. John got it a little wrong. My actual title is Papaw, just so you know. And since I'm a Papaw, I want to tell you a story. There was once an author, a famous author. He had published dozens of titles, prolific, and he had a fan club, book club. And as he followed the discussion of his works on the blogs, he noticed that the critics had really taken over the discussion, and the critics were getting some things wrong, misinterpreting his works. So one day he showed up to one of the book club meetings incognito. Nobody knew who he was just another fan. He listens for a while, and he realizes the critics have really co-opted the whole discussion and misinterpreted his work altogether. And he stood up, He said, I've got something to say. And he spoke for 18 minutes, explaining what the work really meant. And then he sat down. Now, he was not entirely well received. After all, who was he? They didn't recognize him as the author. He was just another fan. And it did lead to some controversy. Ultimately, it cost him his life. The story I just told you actually happened. The author was Yahweh, God of Israel. His collected works numbered 39. You and I call it the Old Testament. His fan club was the nation of Israel that had spent some 2,000 years studying and dissecting all that he had to say. And we actually have a record of his 18-minute talk to his fan club. That record is the Sermon on the Mount. God in the flesh came down, the one who inspired Moses to write those laws, and he said, let me straighten some things out for you. You got it wrong. Let's pray. Father, I thank you that you're here with us in this moment. I pray that in the next few minutes, you would speak to your people by your Spirit through your word, and I would be able to stay out of the way. Amen. The opening of those remarks, that 18-minute talk that we call the Sermon on the Mount, is a selection of sayings, the Beatitudes. And the Beatitudes all follow a format, 2 clauses. Both of them are statements. First, there is a statement, and then there is an explanation. Now, a beatitude or a benediction or a blessing, like Jesus uses here, doesn't always have to have an explanation. If Jesus had said, blessed are the affluent, everybody would say, yes, it makes sense. If Jesus had said, blessed are the healthy, everybody would have said, yes, okay. But instead, Jesus is saying some things that are counterintuitive. He's saying, blessed are the poor in spirit. An explanation is necessary, and so he says, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, really? For they shall be comforted. And so we have that pattern going through the Beatitudes. A blessing, declaration of blessing, and then an explanation. The one for this morning is, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. Now, I want to unpack some of the language here because I think all of these are key terms. And the first one is the word blessed. Most of you are like me. You can't read the Bible in the original languages. You can't read it in Greek and Hebrew. Well, one of the things that tells you something interesting is going on when you see the different English translations rendering it different ways. You know that this is not a self-evident translation, and there's some debate about how it should be translated. And so it is with the word that's translated blessed. As you know, our series is called Happy, and a lot of the English translations will say, happy are the poor in spirit. Happy are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. But I want to unpack the word blessed because it doesn't always mean happy. The word blessed means prosperous in the broadest and fullest sense. Somebody who is favored by God. And I want to tell you a couple of stories to illustrate blessed. Let's pretend you are a hiker and you are on a long hike and it's late in the afternoon and you're getting hungry and it's raining. You're wet, you're hungry, you're cold, you're miserable. And as you're hiking, you can look down and there's a railroad track not very far. And you can actually see the railroad track. And an Amtrak train comes by and you can look into the train car and you can actually see the passengers. And they're warm and they're dry and some of them are in the dining car and they're eating. And you're wet and miserable. And they're warm and dry. Now, given those circumstances, which man would you rather be, the passenger or the hiker? Well, obviously the passenger. The passenger is happy, the hiker is unhappy. But remember, blessed doesn't always mean happy in the moment. You, the hiker, also know that the bridge is out. And that happy passenger is living the last few seconds of his life. Now, who'd you rather be? Who's blessed in that scenario? Or, As John mentioned, I've taught at Dayton Christian High School since 1977. And so I've been getting word about reunions that are coming up. Class of '89 is having a reunion this year. Class of '94 is having their 20th this year. Sometimes people say that junior high and high school are the most miserable times of their life. And they can't wait to be done with it. And I get that. I'm a high school teacher. Sometimes I see that. I see students are pretty unhappy. Let's say that I go to a class of '89 reunion, 25 years out of high school, and I catch up with some of my old students. Now they're adults, they've got children. Some of them are grandparents by now. And I get to know them. And let's say that there's one particular mom, and she is living a beautiful life. She's got a great husband. She's got great kids. She loves her life. But I remember what it was like for her when she was in high school. She was painfully, awkwardly shy. And high school was a difficult time for her. What if I could go from the 25-year reunion back to 1987, 88, 89, when that girl was in high school, and I could say to her, listen, I know it's rough for you now, but you are blessed. Some of these mean girls, some of these cool guys, they're not going to do so well. You're blessed. That's what Jesus is doing here with these Beatitudes. He's picking out people that you wouldn't necessarily pick out and say, there's a winner. You can't see it, but that's a winner. And that's what he's saying here with, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Now, he could have said, blessed are those who yearn for righteousness. He could have said, blessed are those who long for righteousness, but he didn't. He used the language of physicality. Now, whenever we read the scripture, we need to make sure that we don't skip a step. And that step is, how would those original hearers have heard that word? When you and I hear the word hunger, it probably doesn't mean the same thing to us that it meant to a first century Palestinian peasant. I have never known hunger insecurity. There's always been plenty of food at home, and if there wasn't, there was always Hothead within walking distance. Or Eat Rice or Subway, all within walking distance. But I have known thirst. One time my father was stationed in Taiwan before we moved to Dayton, before he was transferred to Wright Pat. And we were in some sort of tourist thing, and we were out for an expedition, and somehow they forgot the soft drinks, they forgot, and here are a bunch of Americans, and we were very thirsty. It had been hours since we had had anything to drink, and the only thing they could produce for us was water that had just been boiled, so it was pretty warm. Guess how thirsty we were? That was delicious water. And I knew what it was like to be that thirsty. So when Jesus says, blessed are those who are hungry and thirsty, he's talking about kind of a fire in the belly. And when I use this, I'll use the word crave. Blessed are those who crave righteousness. Now, I will have to tell you that our grandson Roman is one of the 5 most beautiful babies ever born in the world. You should just know that. But it was a different experience for my wife. My wife has given birth 4 times, but she was actually in the room when our daughter gave birth. And when she came out to the waiting room to tell us, she was crying. And our first thought was, oh no. She was just so incredibly moved at seeing our daughter give birth. But one thing she told me that surprised me is that Roman was born hungry. He was rooting. It was like 1:45 in the morning, and he was ready for something to eat already. He was born hungry. That's the language that Jesus is using. It's a physical craving. Blessed are those who crave. You remember the text from the Psalms, as the deer pants for the water brook, so my soul pants after you, O God. That's the language that Jesus is using. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Once again, the English translations differ here. And we find that the other thing we need to be aware of, not just how did the first hearers hear it, but what assumptions are we bringing? I want you to know that when we read, blessed are those who are hungry for righteousness, we tend to think about personal holiness. We tend to think about integrity and virtue and spiritual disciplines. Blessed are those who are driven by those things. You know, if I were preaching this sermon in some churches, it would have a different flavor. It would have a social justice flavor, wouldn't it? Blessed are those who are hungry for justice to be done for the oppressed. And I might talk about immigration reform or homelessness or racism. Guess what Jesus meant? Guess what the word righteousness means? We don't have to choose between the two. He really meant both. Blessed are those who are craving for personal holiness and for justice to be done. And he talks about this as a craving. And then he says, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. And once again, he returns to this physical language. It's the same words that's used to describe cattle that are fattened. But I want you to notice it's future tense. They will be. And that's going to play an important role here. Now, even just in a superficial reading of this text, I can tell I've got a problem. I can tell I've got two problems. I'm going to be honest with you in front of all of you and say, it would have been easier for me if Jesus had said, blessed are those who prefer righteousness. Because I prefer righteousness. Do I really crave it? Not always. Would I say that a desire for righteousness, personal holiness, and social justice, is that the fire in my belt? I don't know if it really is. But Jesus didn't say, blessed are those who prefer righteousness. Blessed are those who are inclined to see righteousness done. He said, blessed are those who hunger for righteousness. So my first problem is, I'm not sure I really crave righteousness. So maybe he's not talking about me. Maybe I'm not blessed. So I got to thinking, what do I crave? I know what I crave. Sometimes I crave validation. Have you ever told a story to somebody else about a conflict you had with somebody? And you're telling a third party about this conflict you had with somebody. Did you know, if you're like me, you know what you're really doing? You're seeking validation. You want to portray yourself as the hero or the victim. How many times when you've told a story to someone else about a conflict that you had, how many times have you said, and that's where I got too sharp-tongued, and that's where I jumped to conclusions, and that's where I said something that was unnecessarily provocative? No, we don't say those things. We don't portray ourselves that way, because you know what? When we're talking about our conflict with somebody else, we want them to validate us. We want them to take our side. What do I crave? Jesus didn't say, blessed are those who crave validation. You know what else I crave? I crave approval. I just got back a week ago from Honduras, where I gave a series of lectures on worldviews in educational conferences for the International School Project, part of the Jesus Film and Campus Crusade. And every evening we would have team meetings, and the leader of the trip would say, now, what happened in your meetings today? What happened in your small groups this afternoon? And there was this voice running in my head. Say something about the worldview lectures. Say something about how they were impacted by the worldview lectures. Now, I didn't say those things out loud, but that was running through my head. I wanted to hear it. I wanted to hear something about Paul Pyle's talks. I was craving approval. But Jesus didn't say, blessed are those who crave approval. He didn't say, blessed are those who crave validation. And to be honest with myself, sometimes what I crave is sin. I just know it's wrong, and I crave it anyway. But Jesus didn't say, certainly, blessed are those who crave sin. He said, blessed are those who crave, they're hungry and thirsty for righteousness. So what do we make of this saying of Jesus? Is Jesus just giving us a rousing morality pep talk? A lot of people look at the Sermon on the Mount this way. They say, what Jesus did in the Sermon on the Mount is he gave us a sublime, superb kind of ethics, and it's beautiful. And I looked for quotes, and they're easy to find. Did you know Thomas Jefferson did not believe that Jesus is God? He did not believe in the resurrection. He did not believe in miracles at all, but he sure admired the Sermon on the Mount. Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of our Supreme Court justices, said, most people are willing to take the Sermon on the Mount as a flag to sail under, but few will use it as a rudder by which to steer. Harry Truman, I do not believe there is a problem in this country or the world today which could not be settled if approached through the teaching of the Sermon on the Mount. And President John Adams, the Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount contain my religion. Yeah, the Sermon on the Mount does all of that. It is inspiring and encouraging. It is a reliable moral compass. It is a solution to our social problems. Is it the essence of the Christian faith? Is it really? Is this ethic the essence of the Christian faith? Did Jesus mean us to hear the Sermon on the Mount and walk out and say, yes, that's what I want to do? No. As a matter of fact, not just no, but not at all. When Jesus gave us the Sermon on the Mount, what he intended is for us to walk away saying, this is hopeless. There is no way. I want to prove that to you. Before Jesus gets to the end of chapter 5, he tells us what he means by righteousness. And when he does that, we walk away thinking, okay, I don't know anybody who's righteous. I don't know anybody who approaches that kind of righteousness. Look at what Jesus says. First, he says, beginning in verse 20, he said, unless your righteousness is greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees, you can't have any part in the kingdom of God. Seriously? Now remember, you and I hear scribes and Pharisees, we think about the enemies of Jesus, we think about the hypocritical Pharisees and all that. The word Pharisee has all kinds of negative connotations to us, not to his original hearers. Do you know what they heard when they heard Pharisee? The scribes were professional copyists, and they had a rigorous protocol for making sure that there was no error. No error could possibly creep into the text. A scribe could tell you what was the middle letter of the book of Ezekiel. That's how well they knew the text. That's all they did, is copy the text and think about the text and talk about the text. They were experts. And I'm sure when Jesus says, your righteousness needs to be greater than the scribes and Pharisees, people said, how could that be possible? I'm just an ordinary guy, and I don't spend all the time looking at the text the way the scribes do. How? Pharisees are an interesting case. As I was thinking about the Pharisees this week, I realized, you know what? These guys had mastered a scientific approach to law keeping. It's like they were hundreds of years before their time. If the Enlightenment arrives in the 18th century, they are 18 centuries ahead of their time, these Pharisees were. Because they said law keeping needs to be observable and quantifiable, just like science. And so, the question arises, if I am repairing, I'm not making this stuff up, by the way, if I am repairing a garment, how many stitches can I put in a garment repair before I'm doing the work of a tailor and can't do it on Saturday? And the rabbis had worked that out over 1,500 years, and they knew exactly how many stitches you could make on the Sabbath before you had to stop because you'd be doing the work of a tailor. By the time John's gospel is written at the end of the first century, they had worked out exactly how many steps you could take on the Sabbath without violating the Sabbath and actually traveling, because traveling is forbidden, but walking is not. So how many steps do you take walking before you travel? And that distance was so well known that John could say this village was a Sabbath day's journey from that village, and everybody knew what it was. To the Pharisees, the law was observable and quantifiable. Even today, I took a group of students over to Israel in 1997 on a study tour. It is Saturday, and you know how when you're in another country and you're not in your routine, you forget what day it is. Well, it's a Saturday, and we are at the Wailing Wall, and our guide is explaining things to us, and I am taking notes. This is great stuff. A guard comes up to me and says, stop. You may not do that. It was the Sabbath. I was writing too much. Elevators in Israel become automatic on Saturday so that no observant Jew will be guilty of making a fire by pressing the electric button. I'm not making this up. One more, and this is one that's really incredible. There's a certain number of letters you can write consecutively without being guilty of doing the work of a scribe. So if it's Saturday, there's a maximum number of letters that you can write. And so the question came up, not making this up, can you play Scrabble on the Sabbath if you're an observant Jew? And the rabbis got together and thought about it, and they decided, no, you may not. All those letters are touching one another, and so since there are 100 tiles, you're actually violating the Sabbath unless you use the deluxe board, which has ridges between the letters. I'm not making this up, and then it's permitted. Isn't it fun to make fun of other people's legalism? So the Pharisees had become experts in observable, quantifiable law keeping. And when Jesus says, your righteousness needs to be greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees, I'm sure everybody just threw up their hands and said, hold it. I can't be part of the kingdom unless my righteousness exceeds the experts in the law and the experts in law keeping. And just in case we didn't miss that point, Jesus gives us 4 examples. Now remember, this is the lawgiver explaining the law, the true interpretation of the law. And he's calling into question the work of these critics, the scribes and the Pharisees, who've been getting it wrong. And so Jesus gives a series of 4 statements. The first one beginning in verse 21. And he says, you have heard, do not murder. This is true, you must not murder. But if you harbor malicious rage in your heart against another person, you have the heart of a murderer, and you are guilty of murder. By that definition, how many would have to say, serial killer here? Next paragraph, beginning with verse 27. You have heard it said, do not commit adultery. How many of you, like me, are old enough to remember Jimmy Carter's famous interview with Playboy magazine as he was running for president? And Playboy asked, have you ever committed adultery? And Jimmy Carter knew his Bible. And he said, yes, I have. Because Jesus said, if you deliberately contemplate the sexuality of a woman who is not your wife, you've committed adultery. That makes me a serial killer and a serial adulterer. That's what Jesus meant when he said, righteousness greater than that of the scribes and Pharisees. But there's more. Next paragraph, beginning with verse 38. Jesus says, do not resist an evil man. If someone strikes you on one cheek, turn to him the other also. I have heard Christians really struggle with this passage. What do you mean? Jesus doesn't want us to defend ourselves? Kind of looks like what he said. And then what did he do when they struck him? Hard to get around that. And then finally, in the last paragraph, beginning with verse 43, you have heard it said, love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies. And remember, that first century audience, the enemy was living in their land, and the enemy was hard to love. The Romans were constantly offending Jewish sensibilities. They were oppressive, and Jesus said, love your enemies. And just in case we come away from that thinking, well, maybe we're unscathed, he finishes with, be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect. Now, do you think Jesus meant this Sermon on the Mount to leave us inspired and encouraged? No. Not at all. There is a profound sense, I think, when we begin to understand what Jesus means when he says, blessed are those who hunger for righteousness. And once he tells us what that righteousness is, I find myself in a terrible dilemma. I mean, I came into this thinking that the righteousness that he wanted us to hunger and thirst for was right here, and my main problem was I didn't crave it enough. Now that he's defined righteousness, I realize it's way up there. It's like we're all in a high jump contest and the opening height is 10 feet. Are you in? Can't even begin to compete. I have nothing. But it creates a real